It doesn't matter whether or not they're putting a gun to your head. You need to eat and drink or you'll die. And if somebody owns the lake, you're screwed unless you work for them.
What is stopping individuals going away and starting up their own private business and earning money from it? What's stopping them? You could go on about, for example, oh, they can't afford education and they need the skills and all the rest of this nonsense and this, that and the next thing. But, you know, that's going into another argument. But that alone in itself is nonsense because it would be affordable. I mean, even for example, to do with the free market healthcare, you don't understand the very fact that people do have the free choice to go and start up their own business. And they're not forced to go and work for another company. They aren't forced. Otherwise, there wouldn't be job interview processes. It's just, you don't even understand what slavery means, never let alone the word prevent. We'll move on to that.
And if you want a more utilitarian answer instead of a philosophical one, I would simply say the same way that people living in commonly owned land throughout history have been able to allocate resources effectively without deficiency.
Where? Where? Come on. Give me historical examples. Where? Where have you seen communal ownership of land where they've been able to effectively allocate the scarce resources? Come on, where? Without causing waste and without causing shortages, where have you ever seen the allocation of scarce resources? And you want to know why you want to know why I know you're nothing other than a pathological liar, because it is an historical recorded fact that prior to the Industrial Revolution there was a very, very high death rate for hundreds of years and periodical famines. So please tell me, where's these examples? You see, this is where you're good at making claims, but you have no information to back that up with. You talk about history. History before the Industrial Revolution, as I stated, you saw periodical famines for the very reason that there was shortages. And you want to know why there was shortages? There was shortages all because of your communal ownership of farming. That's why when the centralisation of agriculture in the Soviet Union and of course China began, you saw the mass starvation. We also saw the same thing with the Juche idea in, of course, North Korea. Between 1995 to 1998, millions of people had died of starvation. You see, this just proves everything. This is the evidence you don't have a clue about history. How can you expect me to take you seriously when there was an extremely high death rate across the entire world before the Industrial Revolution because of common malnutrition diseases, and yet you sit there and you say that your communal ownership of land, they effectively allocated these scarce resources? Doesn't sound like it to me. If that was the case, why was there an extremely high death rate across the world? Why was it that Edward Gibbon in 1930, an English historian, wrote in his own words that he named several of his children Edward? And he said he named several of his children Edward because he fully expected that most of his children were going to die. And he said that it was a common thing. It was part of life that the parents fully expected their children to die long before the parents. In other words, this was something common before the Industrial Revolution. The average life expectancy of children was the age of 9. So, the very fact for hundreds of years they were dying of starvation and life was miserable. We've even got the French historian Fernand Braudel, who in a terrible winter in 1695 wrote that the peasants were freezing, starving, and dying in their hovels. And he said even the King of France, King Louis XIV, in the Palace of Versailles in France, stared down on his wine glass that had frozen over. What's that telling you? It's telling you that the poorest people today in Britain are actually living better off than what the King of France was in the late 1600s. But what's most important is that this was a French historian, Fernand Braudel, that wrote about this. And why is that important? Because 100 years later, into the Industrial Revolution, a French revolutionary said in his own words, "Happiness is a new idea in Europe." Oh, how interesting. That was a French revolutionary. Isn't that funny? Drawing the contrast between 1695, where life was miserable and they were dying of starvation, to 100 years later, when a French revolutionary stands and says, "Happiness is a new idea in Europe." Isn't that quite interesting? Yes, it is quite interesting. You see, unlike yourself, I actually do my research and I learn history. You don't. You clearly don't have a clue about history. They allocated scarce resources effectively. Did they really? Please give me these examples. This will be fantastic. This will be absolutely fantastic, because before the period of the Industrial Revolution, there's periodical famines for hundreds of years. Okay? Hundreds.
Seriously, look up Eleanor Ostrom. After the medieval era, many communities, especially in England, were able to collectively manage land effectively for hundreds of years without resource mismanagement. And then, of course, the state came along with the wealthy landlords, occupied all the land and created enclosures, which basically forced them off the land and into voluntarily choosing to work for business owners.
What a foolish thing to say. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, with all those periodical famines and an extremely high death rate across the entire world, where the average life expectancy of, a child was the age of 9 and the average life expectancy of an adult was the age of 40, with a very high death rate across the world from common malnutrition diseases, in the step with the enclosure movement, as you mentioned about the enclosure, in the step with this enclosure movement. And isn't it funny how Britain has never faced a famine ever since? But most importantly, what is laughable is the very fact that life expectancy had dramatically increased. Isn't that interesting? Isn't it interesting how once the Industrial Revolution came about, all thanks to the free market, isn't it interesting that the life expectancy, the living standards, had dramatically improved? A socialist historian, in his own words, said that from 1790 to 1840, he conceded to the very fact that living standards had improved. He also said, in his own words, that the industrial towns in Britain in 1840, in quotes, he said, were better off than where they came from the countryside, from those hovels 50 years prior. In other words, the socialist historian is saying that, yes, the conditions were smelly, awful, poor, and, you wouldn't wish to live in them. This is him speaking about the industrial towns, industrial townhouses. But what do you think the houses were like prior to that? What do you think the houses were like in the countryside, the hovels? They were far worse than that. So in other words, this is a socialist historian conceding to the fact that living standards had actually improved. And do you want to know why this makes a fool out of you? Because wealth in the 1600s was measured by land ownership and building ownership. Now here is what makes a fool out of you. Because in the 1600s, 1650 to 1700s, you had three class groups. You had your extremely wealthy, you had your middle class, and you had your working class. Now, your extremely wealthy consisted of 2% of the population. Your middle class consisted of 8% of the population, and your working class consisted of 90% of the population. Why is this important? The 2% between 1650 to 1700, the extremely wealthy owned 80% of the wealth. 2% of the population owned 80% of the wealth, meaning that there was barely any wealth left for the remaining population. So in other words, the middle class that consisted of 8% of the population owned 10% of the wealth, and the working class that consisted of 90% of the population owned 10% of the wealth, as did the middle class, as I stated. What's interesting about this is the very fact that after the first industrial revolution in 1850, the 2% extremely wealthy still consisted of 2% of the population. They were the monarchy. However, because more was added into things, there was more of a measurement in terms of wealth. Not just buildings and land ownership, but of course consisting of so many other things. But what's important here is the 2% no longer owned 80% of the wealth. They now only owned 30% of the wealth. And they consisted of 2% of the population, as I said. Although with the 30% wealth, they were better off than they were from the 1600s. And that's purely because they'd become richer. The middle class, who used to consist of 8% of the population, now consisted of 58% of the population. And they now owned not 10% of the wealth like they did in the 1600s, but they now owned 50% of the wealth. Right? So that's going from 8% of the population to 58% of the population, and going from 10% wealth to 50% wealth. And then you had the working class. The working class, who used to consist of 90% of the population and 10% of the wealth, went to 20% of the wealth, but only consisted of 40% of the population. And the reason for that is because the working class people moved up the ladder. That's why the middle class went from 8% of the population to 58% of the population. But what's important to note from this is the very fact that your common historians wrote a pack of bullshit and said that living standards had collapsed in the first industrial revolution and that the wealth had declined. Wealth had declined? Do you call the working class going from 10% to 20% a wealth decline? Do you call the middle class going from 10% of the wealth to 50% of the wealth a wealth decline? Do you call it a wealth decline with the 2% owning 80% going down to 30%, although owning far more because more was introduced, such as cars and all the rest of this, all the other capital, all the other assets? Do you call them becoming richer a case of, you know, a wealth decline in the first industrial revolution? There you go. There's the prime example. You see, you don't understand anything. You don't know a damn thing. It's just it's laughable when you come across people such as yourself, who like to think you understand what you're talking about, but you don't. This nonsense you're hitting out with about basically stating there that, you know, periods before the Industrial Revolution that there was an allocation of scarce resources efficiently, it's just nonsense. Complete nonsense. Because before the Industrial Revolution, even from Fernand Braudel, even from the likes of Edward Gibbon, we could see how miserable life was. Even the French revolutionary who came out and said in the late 18th century, he came out and basically said in his own words, happiness is a new idea in Europe. Why would a French revolutionary come out and say that in his own words?
But at least remember this as to why we think that the word libertarian would be far more appropriate as a leftist word as opposed to a rightist word, by what is physically advocated by libertarians. We don't just want to have this sort of, ANCAP level playing fields whereby you just allow everybody to do whatever they want so long as it's voluntary, the good old V word. It's about creating a system that allows people to have as much individual freedom as possible, and one of those ways we found out is by owning land collectively, or, being of the land collectively. If everyone gets an equal amount of power in how things are organized. Now, this is a far greater domain of freedom to have collective democratic management and personal property, which would never be taken away from you, than having hierarchical private property, whereby there will always be a few people at the top that have power and money and land.
And here comes the usual myth of the century. You cannot name one single example of a monopoly that has ever existed in recorded history under a capitalist system. You can't name one single example. Not one. Not a single example. You can't name the De Beers Group. You can't name Standard Oil. You can't name any example of where a monopoly ever existed under a free market system. You can't name one single example. Yet there you are to sit there and say that under a capitalist system there will always be this extremely wealthy, 1%, and, the rest will live in extreme poverty and all this, complete and utter nonsense. It's laughable. Standard Oil never held a monopoly. But what proved in history was that Standard Oil made the whole of society richer as a result of John Davis and Rockefeller's business. All thanks to his private business. He even opened the door to Henry Ford's automobile industry. And look how that revolutionised the world in terms of all the automobiles. It's remarkable just how ignorant people such as yourself are. It really is. I mean, where do you get these baseless, silly claims from? Where do you get them from? It's just nonsense what you're hitting out with. Try backing that up with recorded history. Try coming back to me with actual examples rather than making silly, baseless claims just because it sounds good. It's a common myth, in fact. That's all you're hitting out with is a myth.
And those at the bottom have to create the wealth for those big guys, because you cannot have 100% entrepreneurialism. There will always be a greater need for the workers than there will be for the bosses.
People at the bottom who are extremely poor create the wealth for the big guys. That's so laughable. That is laughable. You see, the thing is, let's just take, for example, a big company, right? A big company became a big company because of its success in terms of what it produced. You could talk about Apple as a company. It doesn't matter whether it's had government favours or not and all the rest of this nonsense, okay? Okay? What's most important is they created a product that consumers valued. Let's say, for example, Apple never produced these products. Let's say, for example, Apple produced products that were substandard and piss poor. Do you think consumers would buy from them? No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't be anywhere near as successful as they are today. That's how important consumers' demand is. Yes? Yes. That's the importance of consumers' demand. But what is it that created the wealth? What created the wealth? What drove those consumers to the business? What drove them to it? Do you understand anything at all to do with the running of a business? What goes into it? The marketing? Advertising? Do you even understand what goes into a business? The importance of capital, such as your assets, such as talking about the tools, the machinery. What is it that creates the jobs? It's the capital. It's all the machinery. That's what created the jobs. But what's most important, if it wasn't for the, producer, the innovation of Steve Jobs, if it wasn't for a successful business owner, he wouldn't have been able to grow his business in order to create more jobs out of it. In other words, his success in producing something that consumers wanted, his innovative mind, enabled the company to grow in wealth, to expand his business, and produce more jobs. And what did the more jobs do? It created wealth for the poor. You don't even get this, do you? You can't even grasp something this simple. This is what I mean. How can anyone take you seriously? Do you not understand the importance of the success of any business owner? It's all well talking about, at the end of the day, consumers going and putting their money into a business and it makes them rich. It's not as simple as that. What if I was a business owner and I produced complete and utter fucking shit? You think consumers are wanting to buy my shit? No. So it's more than just a case of, producing products. You have to produce something of value in order to drive consumers to your business, don't you? You have to be able to run a business efficiently in order to help expand the business. You're not going to be able to expand your business if you're running at a loss, are you? Are you? You don't get that, do you? You don't get that. This is so sad. This is so sad. This honestly is. It's like teaching a 12-year-old. And I'm sorry that that's an insult to the young kids. But you, who looks as if you're in your mid-20s or something, you can't even grasp something this simple. It's not just a case of consumers are the ones that make businesses rich. What about the business who owns the machinery, who created the jobs, who created the produce that became valuable? In other words, the reason for Apple's great success was it innovated and created something revolutionary. Touchscreen technology and all the rest of it. Maybe they weren't the first ones that did it. It doesn't matter. They created something of value that consumers demanded. In fact, they created the demand from their innovative, technology. And all because of their intelligent marketing strategy, where they keep people on a knife's edge. They keep people, intrigued about what's coming out about their new product. All of these intelligent marketing strategies is what keeps consumers coming back for more. So, how do you drive that consumer demand? You drive the consumer demand by providing quality. But it's not just a case of, it's not just a case of producing goods. You need good leadership. You need smart, rulership over business management. So, you see, these rich people became rich because they produced something of value to what people enjoy. And that's the reason why the company owner of Amazon became so wealthy and successful. Why did he become so successful? Because he created something that everybody can just go on and buy from. Something that's so wonderful to us all, that many people have benefited from, whether you like that fact or not. That's the truth. It doesn't matter about the exploitation. The exploitation is wrong. That's to do with the economic system. But you can't knock the success of the business. You can't knock the success of the business. You really can't. I can name many successful business owners that became extremely rich. But they done so because they produced something of value. Just you're so nonsensical.
One very last point. Scotty, if you're wondering why anarchists are opposed to you being able to own your own business, yeah, we're opposed to you being able to subjugate others under your authority in order to obtain the means by which to survive.
You see, this is where you completely make a fool out of yourself. I mean, how the hell can you call this libertarian? You've literally just admitted, that you seek to prevent. Do you even understand what the definition of that word means? To prevent. You're seeking to prevent individuals from owning their own private business. Therefore, how is that libertarian? And in order to prevent, in order to, stop individuals from owning their own business, from creating their own business, you're going to need an element there to control that. And who's going to be the controller? Who's going to be that controller to prevent individuals from owning their own business? You're setting it in stone that you're preventing individuals from owning their own business. So in other words, what you're saying is that individuals should not have the liberty to create their own private business where consumers can buy from voluntarily and workers can work for you voluntarily. What's preventing other individuals going away and starting up their own business? Nothing. But that's not the point. The point of the issue is you're wanting to prevent me from owning my own business. How the hell can you call that libertarian? How can you? How can you call that libertarian? You're infringing upon my rights. You're taking away my right to own my own private business. And who are you to stop other individuals by their free choice working for my company? Who are you to stop them? It's not down to you. If they want to work for my company, they would. So, you see, you don't even understand the meaning of the word libertarian. You don't. Your idea of libertarian is preventing individuals from owning their own business. And in order to do that, you need an element there to keep it out of place. In other words, you need a central planner, who in other words is the government. See, that's what I mean. I'm done with you. You're a joke.